While it might seem almost inevitable that a filmmaker of my generation talking about what has influenced him should include Blade Runner on the list because it was one of those films that just had to be seen, I will claim a certain degree of satisfaction in knowing that, in fact, Blade Runner was not initially received very well, and I loved it from the first moment I saw it, and I dragged a couple of friends to see it, and they were very polite about their reaction, but not all that crazy about it. It took a while for it to acquire its reputation as a classic, and so I can pat myself on the back. I can pat myself on the back for seeing its qualities from the very beginning. So, what makes Blade Runner special for me? Well, first of all, I have to say that at the time that it came out, 1982, that was a very significant year for me because that was the year that I finished my big student film, The Off-Season. And so even though there's very little relationship between The Off-Season and Blade Runner, I will always sort of group them together in my memory because of that moment. And also the early 80s, and it's very difficult for people who didn't live through them to understand that the early 80s was a very scary time. When Ronald Reagan was elected president in 1980, those of us who didn't particularly want Ronald Reagan for president were really concerned that we might be on the verge of nuclear war. And then there's stuff like acid rain. It's never described as such, but that was in the air at the time as an issue. So the fact that there's so much rain in the film is a big deal. The early 80s was also an interesting moment in terms of fashion and style, because it was the moment when the influence of punk and the fashions derived from punk were entering the mainstream. It was also when postmodern design in general was taking over. So, for example, if you ever watch the movie carefully and you look at the graphics that you see in the background that are meant to be the street scenes, etc., that combination of serif and sans serif type, it was very early 80s, very, very much part of the postmodern revolution, if you will. But what does that have to do with me personally as a person, as a filmmaker? Well, I would say that the overriding quality that I got from Blade Runner was its sense of texture, which I've already referred to in relation to Stalker, and particularly its use of space. It's hardly the first film to use space, but what I found really fascinating when I saw the film was the sense that although I knew it was all shot on a sound stage in the back lot, etc., that when you look at it, you have the sense of the world really does extend beyond the range of the camera, beyond the crew, whatever, that this is the world of 2019, yes, 2019, and you are in it, you're part of it, and the rain contributes to that, but there's just this strong sense of physical presence, and I think that was probably the single most important influence on me. And then finally, also related to the space issue, is Ridley Scott's use of cutaways as part of the editing style. Now, this is kind of a subtle thing, but I'll just say that the editing style in Blade Runner was not revolutionary in any sense. It was interesting in carrying through what could be called the aesthetics of TV commercial editing based on the cutaway. The cutaway in film editing is when you are focused on something and you cut to something else without necessarily there being any strict motivation for it, either visual motivation or narrative motivation. And so the fact that he uses that so frequently adds to the sense of dislocation and not quite rightness, if you will. Seeing it in Blade Runner, it was a real eye-opener. As I mentioned, it came out the year that I finished my film, The Off-Season, and there isn't any relation to what I did in the editing of that film. But after that, I did use that kind of editing, in fact, still use that kind of editing. And so I credit Blade Runner with being really the eye-opener in this regard. So, anyway, that's what I have to say about Blade Runner. It's one of the few films in this list that most people don't need to be told what it is. I know it's so famous. For me, it will always be one of the most important films in my personal history.